So, good evening, everybody. So, welcome to today's academics. Happy New Year to everybody joining there. So, today we are going to discuss case-based approach to diabetes in pregnancy. Let's look into what are the effects of diabetes in pregnancy in the newborn. So, for today's session, we have two excellent speakers. So, we have Dr. Akshaya Dodamani, who is the obstetrician at Ovum Hospital, to take us through the obstetric perspective. So we also have Dr. Anil Kalesh, who will take us through the pediatric perspective. So we have today's moderators, Dr. Vandana Krishna Madam. So she heads the OBG department at Shreya Hospital, Kolar. Welcome to you, ma'am. So we have Dr. Biregowda sir, who is actually professor of pediatrics at Devarajaras Medical College, and he's head of pediatrics at Chaudeshwari Hospital as well at Kolar. Welcome to you, sir. And we also have Dr. Basavaraj, who is an endocrinologist who actually works primarily in Narayana Hridayalaya at Electronic City, as well as he's also started visiting ETCM Hospital at Kolar. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Anil. Thanks.
So first, let's hear from the obstetric perspective from Dr. Akshaya. So, Vandana Madam, shall we start?
Sir. Yes, sir. All the best, Akshaya.
Thank you, Madam. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, all the respected doctors. Thank you very much for sparing some time. So quickly, we'll begin with the diabetes in pregnancy. We all know the importance of this topic because of the increasing prevalence of diabetes in pregnancy. In India, the rates are much higher when we compare it with our Western counterparts. The rates being in India is 10 to 14.3%. In our own Ovum hospital, we have around 15% of GDM cases every month. In a field study in Tamil Nadu, they also have classified according to the areas, like in urban population, semi-urban, and in rural areas. So that reflects the importance of this topic even in the rural population and how much we have to be vigilant about it. So coming to the classification, as we all know, it is the gestational diabetes mellitus, which represents 90% of the cases, type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So gestational diabetes is again subclassified into GDM A1, which is the diabetes which is controlled with just diet and exercises. GDM A2 is the one where the GDM is controlled along with diet and exercises which require medications in the form of insulin or oral tablets, oral medications. Type 1 diabetes, we rarely see. This is, as we all know, due to the autoimmune destruction of beta cells in the pancreas. Type 2 diabetes, the prevalence is rapidly increasing. It is becoming an epidemic. In the next few years, it is estimated that 1 in 5 pregnancies will turn out to have type 2 diabetes. So what causes gestational diabetes? It is, as we all know, the placental hormones, the human placental lactogen growth hormone, prolactin, cortisol, any hormone in the body except insulin, all have the anti-insulin effect in the body. So all the hormones will actually cause insulin resistance. The reasons for rising epidemic, the type 2 diabetes and gestational diabetes is on the rise. This is because of the sedentary lifestyle, increasing maternal age, more than 30 years. PCOS is the most common finding, obesity and metabolic syndrome. So as we all know the consequences, maternal risk involves abortion, polyhydramnios, preeclampsia, prolonged labor, operative vaginal delivery, difficult deliveries, obstructed labor, higher rates of induction of labor as well as cesarean sections, TPH and infection rates. Fetal risk, intrauterine fetal death, stillbirth, congenital malformations, miscarriages, shoulder dystocia, birth injuries, neonatal hypoglycemia, respiratory distress syndrome, and a lot of other complications which will be dealt with the pediatrician in the next few minutes. So coming quickly to the screening tests. What is the importance of screening test and what are the evidences we have? The ACOG, the American and Canadian guidelines say it has to be an universal screening. That is a two-step approach wherein they do a 50-gram OGCT, and if it comes like it's more than 140 mg per deciliter, the patient is referred for a 100-gram OGTT test wherein 4 values are recorded. And if 2 of the 4 values come abnormal, that is out of the range, then it is termed as having gestational diabetes. Coming to the NICE and Australian guidelines, they screen only at-risk population. According to them, the at-risk population is the one who have previous gestational diabetes, who have in the previous pregnancy, previous macrosomic baby, family history, like in the first degree relative if they are diabetic, or if the woman is obese with a BMI more than 30. They all come under at-risk population, and for them they screen with a 75-gram OGTT, wherein the fasting is more than 101 and 2 hour OGTT it's more than 140, they term it as GDM. And the WHO classification, the WHO screening test says that it has to be done universal screening. That is, every pregnant woman have to be screened with a 75-gram 2-hour blood sugar. Here, the lady can come any point of time, irrespective of the meal. A 75-gram glucose load is given, and 2 hours later, the sugars are tested. And if it comes more than 140, it's termed as gestational diabetes. And we have our own national guidelines set up by MOHFW. So they say a single step procedure, but it is for the universal screening. That is, all pregnant women in India have to be screened for gestational diabetes. The first time when they come for the antenatal checkup in the first trimester itself, they have to be subjected for the universal screening. That is with 75-gram 2-hour blood sugar, which is as same as the WHO screening one, wherein they give a 75-gram load and then check after 2 hours. And if the cutoff is more than 140, it is termed as gestational diabetes. If this test comes out to be normal, again, the test has to be done between 24 to 28 weeks of pregnancy in a similar way. So the key point is the test is to be conducted for all pregnant women, even if she comes late in the pregnancy, like even if she comes around 34 weeks with no previous blood checkups, she has to undergo the 75-gram sugar test at that time also. And whenever a lady is diagnosed to have gestational diabetes, she should be provided with adequate information, like what the diabetes will do to the pregnancy and what pregnancy can do to the diabetes thing. And the consequences on the mother as well as the baby have to be informed in detail. And that's when we can have compliance from the mother, from the woman. So management of gestational diabetes should ideally be a multidisciplinary team involving gynecologist, physician, dietitian. So mainly whenever a gestational diabetes is diagnosed, a lady is advised for medical nutrition therapy and exercises for 2 weeks. Here we will, after 2 weeks, we will evaluate the lady and check her 2-hour postprandial blood sugar. If it is anything more than 120, we need to start on with the diabetic therapy in the form of insulin or metformin. If the sugars are well controlled, that is the 2-hour postprandial sugar is less than 120, just follow-up have to be done on a monthly basis. Frequency of tests. So for those patients to whom we have started with insulin, we need to monitor fasting sugars and postprandial blood sugars every 3rd day or more frequently if it is not getting under control. And for those who are on metformin, bi-weekly measurements have to be done. This is according to the Indian national guidelines. However, ACOG and RCOG advise sugars need to be monitored daily to all women who have been diagnosed with GDM, whether the woman is just on diet exercise or she's on insulin or on metformin, sugars have to be monitored daily is what ACOG and RCOG says. But for the national guidelines, this is what it is. So basically all of them say the same thing. Strict blood glucose control is a must so that we avoid all the complications as much as possible. So when we come insulin therapy, it is the gold standard for the treatment of gestational diabetes after we start with the diet and exercise thing. So insulin is the human insulin premix is usually started 30:70 ratio 1 once a day. And depending on the blood sugars, we give the dose of the insulin. It has to be given 30 minutes before breakfast. And if the sugars are getting under control, we maintain the same dosage of insulin. However, if the sugars are still not under control, then we need to titrate the insulin dosage by 2 units pre-breakfast and then see whether the postprandial thing is getting under control. If both fasting as well as postprandial is not under control, we need to divide the insulin dosages into 2 doses and titrate accordingly. So this is the chart. Ideally, the target levels is fasting should be less than 95, 2-hour postprandial should be less than 120. So depending on that, we need to adjust the doses. If the fasting thing is high, we need to increase the night dose, the pre-dinner dose by 2 units. If the postprandial dose if sugar is high, we need to increase the pre-breakfast dose of insulin. This is how we need to titrate the insulin doses, and we need to educate the women regarding signs of hypoglycemia. Coming to metformin, metformin has been very commonly used nowadays in all GDM mothers. This is because a patient prefers to have oral medicines rather than injecting forms. The dosage is ideally 500 mg twice daily. It can be increased up to 2 grams. That is, we can give 1 gram BD dose. Hypoglycemia and weight gain with metformin are less in comparison with insulin. And metformin can also be started as an add-on therapy to insulin if the sugars are not adequately controlled even in high doses of insulin. The side effects, the adverse effects of metformin have to be explained to the woman. So the target levels, this is what we have to explain to the patient, that the fasting levels should always be less than 90. Pre-prandial, that is any time they take before the meal, it should be less than 100. 1 hour post meal, less than 140. 2 hour post meal, less than 120. Anytime it should be more than 60 mg per deciliter to prevent any hypoglycemic attacks. So this strict sugar control is all that is important in GDM or in pre-existing diabetes. Antenatal care. So whenever a lady is diagnosed with gestational diabetes, one thing is we need to provide her the complete information, advice, and growth scan is something which is important. It has to be performed between 28 to 30 weeks. And one more growth scan, interval growth scan, has to be repeated at 34 to 36 weeks. The frequency of visits gets shortened since it comes under high-risk pregnancy every 1 to 2 weeks. We need to monitor every time whenever a baby comes, whenever mother comes for a checkup for abnormal fetal growth or signs of polyhydramnios. We need to monitor for hypertension and preeclampsia, as there is an increased prevalence of preeclampsia in uncontrolled GDM mothers. In pregnant women who are having GDM and between 24 to 34 weeks, if we have to terminate the pregnancy, if we have to deliver, antenatal steroids should be given. That is what we advise is injection dexamethasone 6 mg, 12th hourly 4 doses. However, the sugars have to be more vigilantly monitored because the dexamethasone being a steroid increases the sugar levels. So the insulin have to be, the units have to be altered. So coming to the timing of delivery, where a lady with a poorly controlled gestational diabetes may be considered for late preterm or early term birth in an individualized manner. Women with well-controlled GDM, gestational diabetes, whether just by diet and exercises or on medicines, if it is well controlled, Induction of labor should be scheduled at or after 39 weeks if she has not delivered yet. In case of fetal macrosomia, that is more than 4 kgs according to the Indian guidelines, consider primary cesarean section at 39 weeks. During labor, whenever a patient comes in labor or when she is admitted for induction of labor, her morning dose of insulin or metformin should be withheld. In the latent phase of labor, sugars can be monitored every 2 to 4 hours. In the active phase of labor, sugars need to be monitored second hourly. And whoever who is on insulin and with and not so well controlled, IV infusion with normal saline to be started and regular insulin added according to the sugar levels. So this is how we adjust the dose and give insulin to the mother in active labor. Vaginal delivery should be preferred and cesarean sections done only for obstetric indications. Postpartum period, stop the glucose lowering agents immediately after birth since it is gestational diabetes. On day 3, usually in our hospital, we discharge the patients on day 3. So we test the patient with fasting and postprandial blood sugars to exclude persisting hyperglycemia. If the sugars are still high on day 3, it's again termed as type 2 diabetes mellitus and not as gestational diabetes mellitus. If the sugars come out to be normal, at 6 weeks, the woman is called again to do 75 gram OGTT. This is to rule out whether she has impaired glucose tolerance or whether she has type 2 diabetes mellitus. Impaired glucose tolerance, if the values come between 140 to 199, type 2 if the value is more than 200. So long-term impact, we need to educate the women at the time of discharge that 1/3 of them may have impaired glucose tolerance at 6 weeks and up to 50% of them will develop type 2 diabetes in later life. So this will tell us the importance of continuing the diet and exercise therapy, and the patient has to control that, continue with that. So coming to the case scenario, we have a patient, 25-year-old, BMI 30, primary with 33 weeks of pregnancy, coming for the first time to our hospital. She has come with a RBS of 230 mg per deciliter in her previous test reports. And her growth scan shows AFI 26 with fetal weight approximately 3.2 kgs. So how do we follow up? Firstly, this is a random blood sugar test of 230 mg per deciliter. That is why we need to do further tests like fasting blood sugar and postprandial blood sugar. Here we did not do OGTT test because the sugars are already 230 mg, which is like over diabetes. So she is already proven to be diabetic. We don't have to do a glucose tolerance test for her. She is proven to be diabetic and we have to do just the fasting postprandial sugars. We should also do HbA1c values. This is to classify the patient whether she has GDM or whether she has pre-existing diabetes. If HbA1c comes less than 6.5, unlikely she has chronic type 2 diabetes. It is most probably a gestational diabetes. Also, we do a urine analysis test. So as I told earlier, strict sugar control is the key. So whenever a patient with the fasting sugars 130 and the postprandial sugars 212 has come, we can't, and she's already 33 weeks with polyhydramnios and a macrosomic baby already. We can't just go on trying with the medical nutritional therapy in the form of diet exercises for 2 weeks and then think of switching on to insulin or metformin. We should immediately start everything at once. We should advise her about the low glycemic index foods, exercises, and start the anti-diabetic therapy in the form of insulin. And if it is not well controlled with just insulin, we may have to add metformin to her. Also, we need to assess the fetal well-being. We need to educate the woman regarding daily fetal movement count. As she is a case of uncontrolled gestational diabetes, there is a high risk of stillbirth or intrauterine fetal death. So DFMC is something which is very important. And at regular intervals, AFI scan and a biophysical profile scan has to be done. and she has to be evaluated, and we have to rule out any obstetric complications in the form of hypertension or proteinuria, preeclampsia. And the sugars, as discussed before, have to be strictly monitored on a daily basis or every third day basis, depending on how well the sugars are getting controlled. Mode and timing of delivery in this patient. The patient sugars, when she came for the follow-up, they were adequately controlled. However, she came with reduced baby movements, fetal movements at 36 weeks. A biophysical profile scan was done and the score was 4. Hence, she was planned for emergency cesarean section. We delivered a 4.1 kg baby. The surgery and recovery period was uneventful. There was no infection. Post-op day 3. So in this patient, we checked her sugar levels at the time of discharge on day 3. Her fasting was 95 and her postprandial was 146. That is okay. So we counseled her regarding the how to continue her diet and exercises and the importance of this. And she was called up again at 6 weeks for a 75 gram OGTT test, which was within normal limits. And during that time also, counseling needs to be done regarding the importance of strict diet control, exercises, and maintaining a normal BMI. And she is counseled about weight reduction as her BMI was 30. This is one case scenario. Coming to the next case scenario, a 32-year-old lady with type 2 diabetes on oral hypoglycemic agent, she was on metformin with a normal BMI, has come for a pre-pregnancy counseling. So I would be really happy whenever a patient comes for a pre-pregnancy counseling rather than an unplanned pregnancy, especially in a lady with a type 2 diabetes. Whenever a lady for pre-pregnancy counseling comes, we need to provide her adequate information, advice, and support. We need to tell her about the importance of good blood glucose control, that it reduces the risk of miscarriages, congenital malformations, stillbirth, and neonatal death. The importance of diet, exercise, and maintaining the optimal BMI. And every lady with a pre-existing diabetes have to be screened for diabetic retinopathy, which is very important, not routinely followed though. She has to be screened for diabetic nephropathy in the form of creatinine, EGFR, and albumin creatinine ratios. And in case the HbA1c levels are not adequately controlled, if she is not, if there is diabetic retinopathy, if her BMI is high, then we should advise her about the role of contraception. We should tell her that oral contraceptive pills are safe and she has to take as long as the HbA1c levels come under control. We need to give her folic acid supplements, which will reduce the chances of neural tube defects. We should advise her to get down her HbA1c levels on a monthly basis and try to maintain her HbA1c less than 6.5%. And in case the HbA1c is more than 10%, she should be advised not to get pregnant until it reduces, because of the very high increased chances of miscarriages and congenital structural malformations. We need to advise her about self-monitoring of blood glucose levels. And certain medicines, if the lady has been taking, like AC inhibitors, they have to be stopped if the lady is trying for pregnancy or immediately if she conceives. And a lady with pre-existing diabetes, when she has come for antenatal care, along with the routine antenatal care, what we do, the important one is the ultrasound for fetal viability. After this, and in case if the lady has not undergone retinal assessment, nephropathy assessment, we have to do it at the time of booking appointment, that is at the first visit. Once that is all done, the routine NT scan, double marker, all the tests are done. And at 20 weeks, this detailed ultrasound scan is very, very important to detect structural abnormalities. When it comes to the growth scan, we have to do at 28 weeks and again at 32 weeks and for the interval scans and to check the AFI and the biophysical profile. The retinal assessment has to be repeated again at 28 weeks, even though it was normal in the initial assessment. a lady with pre-existing diabetes is admitted between 37 to 39 weeks, depending on her sugar control, and offered induction of labor or cesarean section. Cesarean section only for obstetric indications. And in the antenatal care, her monitoring of sugars, how frequently it has to be monitored, the target levels, and the dosage of insulin, the role of metformin, everything remains the same as it was for gestational diabetes. Postnatal care, we should resume the woman to her pre-pregnancy care in the form of the same doses what she was taking pre-pregnancy. Her sugar, her insulin doses, what she was taking during her pregnancy, they have to be reduced because there is increased risk of hypoglycemia in a breastfeeding mother. And in case she has the hypoglycemic risks, she needs to be advised to take snacks in between the breastfeeding or before breastfeeding the baby. And she can continue metformin, but safety of other medicines, that is ACE inhibitors, are still, they are not safe in a breastfeeding woman and they have to be deferred. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Akshaya, for the wonderful presentation. We'll have questions at the end. I would now invite Dr. Anil Kalesh, consultant neonatologist and pediatrician from Sarji Hospital, Shimoga, to present the neonatal perspective. That is, what are the challenges we face as neonatologists when we have history of either gestational diabetes or diabetes in the mother. Over to you, Dr. Anil.
Sir, am I audible, sir?
Anil, you are audible. You can make full screen. Yeah, Anil, it's full screen.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So I'll be outlining the neonatal case description of an infant of diabetic mother. And also I would like to give overview of fetal and neonatal effects of maternal hyperglycemia and what are the perinatal and neonatal challenges we face when we encounter an infant born to a gestational diabetes mother or a pre-existing diabetes mother. So we have a baby of N who is first born to a non-consanguineously married couple to a primi gravida mother. And this baby was admitted to NICU at 12 hours of life with chief complaints of respiratory distress. So coming to her antenatal history, it was a spontaneous conception and her antenatal visits were regular. She was booked and followed up at hospital, and post-conceptional folic acid was taken, and no history suggestive of any fever or rash or radiation exposure or any other teratogenic drug intake during the first trimester. Her nuchal thickness and nasal bone screening ultrasound were normal, and dual markers were not done during the first trimester. And in second and third trimester, her quickening she felt at 5th month, and she received 2 doses of TT injection, and she has consumed iron and calcium tablets for 100 days. At level 2 ultrasound was told to be normal. There is no history of any raised BP records. There is no history of bleeding PV or leaking per vagina. There is no history of any icterus or itching in the mother. However, during her mid-third trimester antenatal checkup, mother was told to have elevated sugar records and increased liquor in her amniotic fluid, that is amniotic fluid. And she was started on drug therapy, that is metformin. However, she was non-compliant with the diet advice, neither with the drug or sugar monitoring. According to a history given by mother, her RBS records were between 130 to 140 mg per DL, and she was monitoring infrequently once in 6 to 7 days. And there is no family history of any abortions, neonatal deaths, or jaundice in the family. And only significant antenatal history was high sugar records in the mother and irregular home monitoring of dextrose. Coming to birth history, it was a full-term cesarean section delivery in view of failure of progression of labor. Birth weight was 3.2 kg. Baby cried immediately after birth. Apgar scores were 7 and 9 at 1 minute and 5 minutes respectively. Baby was breastfed within 1 hour after birth, and there was no gross congenital malformation which was obvious at birth. Birth weight was 3.2 kg. Length of the baby was 47.5 centimeter, and OFC was occipitofrontal circumference. The head circumference was 35 centimeter, and all the parameters were between 25th to 50th centile. On gross examination of the baby was found to have a broad shoulder part and increased fat deposition in the shoulder and the scapular region, and some doubtful hairy pinna was present in the neonate. So on day 1, the baby was shifted to mother side for breastfeeding. However, between 8 to 12 hours of life, the baby was noted to have respiratory distress, for which she was shifted to NICU and was started on nasal prongs oxygen. So with this antenatal history and perinatal history, we initially kept the possibility of early onset neonatal sepsis with pneumonia or a transient tachypnea of newborn in view of LSCS delivery, and PPHN or other congenital heart diseases were on the cards for differential diagnosis. Chest X-ray done in the baby showed fluid in the interlobar fissures, and plus there were some infiltrates. So with the sepsis screen showing CRP of 4.16 milligram per deciliter, which is a borderline positive report, the baby was started on first line antibiotics. CBC showed hematocrit of 69%, which was elevated. More than 65%, we call it as polycythemia in a neonate. RBS done at the time of admission was 38 milligram per deciliter. Previous RBS monitoring records were normal, and feeds were given. And however, the repeat RBS after 1 hour was still at 30 milligram per deciliter, and baby was asymptomatic. And according to the protocols, the baby was started on GIR of 6 milligram per kg per minute. However, in view of not maintaining the desired sugar levels, GIR required to be hiked to 8 milligram per kg per minute, after which the sugar records were normal. And polycythemia of the baby improved spontaneously in the subsequent hemograms. So the baby had the course of the hospital. Baby had respiratory distress, for which baby was required nasal prong oxygen, and we tried to give off oxygen trials on day 2, day 3, day 4. However, we failed to make the baby off oxygen, and baby was made off oxygen on day 5 of life. In view of suspected early onset neonatal sepsis, first line antibiotics were started, and subsequently were hiked to second line IV antibiotics. Thus, in the culture reports, blood culture sensitivity were sterile. Antibiotics were stopped on day 6 of life. Baby had jaundice or onset between 30 to 34 hours of life. Maximum jaundice reached was 17.1, for which baby received phototherapy. There was asymptomatic polycythemia, which spontaneously recovered, and there was asymptomatic hypoglycemia also in the index child, which required GIR up to 8, and oral feeds were started on day 2, day 3 of life, and the GIR was stopped on day 4 of life, and subsequently baby maintained oral on direct breastfeeds and was discharged on day 6 of life. So our working diagnosis was it's a term appropriate for gestational age male baby, and probably infant of diabetic mother, and with transient tachypnea of newborn, and asymptomatic polycythemia and asymptomatic hypoglycemia in the neonate, with suspected early onset neonatal sepsis with blood culture sensitivity, was sterile. Though this baby did not have any complicated course, however, things might go haywire when the sugar records of the mother are really high and if they are not controlled. So I would like to briefly take you through the fetal and the neonatal effects of maternal hyperglycemia. Already the classification of diabetes, screening, diagnosis, and the effect of pregnancy on the metabolic regulation and obstetric complications have already been described earlier by our obstetrician. So I would like to only concentrate on the fetal and the neonatal effects and the management of infant of diabetic mother. So the fetal effects can be termed as fetal embryopathy or a diabetic if the maternal hyperglycemia is prevalent during the first trimester, or a diabetic fetopathy if the high sugar records in the mother are encountered during second and third trimester of the life. Both will have different effects and different complications in the fetus and neonate. During the neonatal period, we are number of congenital anomalies or growth abnormalities in the baby or an IUGR, respiratory distress syndrome in a neonate, and metabolic and hematological complications. And definitely the infant of diabetic mother are going to have long-term significant abnormal outcomes also. So diabetic embryopathy is directly linked to the maternal hyperglycemia during the first trimester. So already a pre-existing diabetic mothers, if they conceive without a proper sugar control, they will definitely be having higher sugar records. So maternal hyperglycemia will cause fetal hyperglycemia and subsequently causing congenital anomalies. So the HbA1c has a direct correlation with the number of major congenital malformations and spontaneous abortions that occur in the first trimester. So HbA1c of more than 12% significantly increases the risk of congenital anomaly, and better glycemic control has a decreased risk. So in one of the studies, it shows that 30% reduction of with congenital anomalies are seen with every 1% decrease in HbA1c levels. So adequate pre-existing diabetes control is very, very important before conception. So this is a pathogenesis of congenital anomalies which result in diabetic embryopathy. So maternal hyperglycemia during an organogenesis period, that is during 5th to 8th week of embryonic life, results in fetal hyperglycemia. So fetal hyperglycemia causes increased metabolic rate in the tissues. There will be excess formation of oxygen free radicals in mitochondria of the susceptible tissues. This will generate number of free radicals, that is hydroperoxides, and these hydroperoxides, they will inhibit the prostacyclin. There will be overabundance of thromboxanes and other vasoconstrictive prostaglandins, and this results in disruption of vascularization in the developing tissues. So a disruption of vascularization in the developing organ tissues will result in number of congenital anomalies. So until late 1970s to 80s, there was no pathogenesis that was described for infant of diabetic mother, though there were a number of anomalies seen. So this pathogenesis was given by Pedersen, and it is famously called as Pedersen hypothesis. So maternal hyperglycemia can result in fetal hyperglycemia, and this fetal hyperglycemia has a different response when it is before 20 weeks of gestation and after 20 weeks of gestation. Fetus can only respond to hyperglycemia by secreting insulin only after 20 weeks of gestation. So before 20 weeks of gestation, the fetal hyperglycemia is going to have adverse effects as previously described. It will cause a free radical injury resulting in number of congenital anomalies. However, after 20 weeks of gestation, if there is fetal hyperglycemia, it will result in fetal hyperinsulinemia also. This hyperinsulinemia is going to have number of adverse effects, such as neonatal hypoglycemia in early neonatal period, that is 0 to 7 days postnatally. Insulin can also decrease surfactant production during the fetal period. This will result in RDS even though it is a term baby. And it can also result in immature liver metabolism that will cause increased risk of jaundice in the neonate. And fetal hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia together, they can result in fetal macrosomia. And macrosomia can result in birth asphyxia, cardiomyopathy, and transient tachypnea of newborn. So because of macrosomia, there will be increased growth of the fetus during the late second and third trimester, and the placenta will not be able to supply enough nutrients or oxygen to the growing fetus, and this will result in fetal hypoxia that will occur in the after 30 weeks of gestation as the fetus growth increases enormously. So this fetal hypoxic environment will result in a polycythemia. This will also increase the jaundice, and the polycythemia will also increase the risk of stroke and renal vein thrombosis in the newborn. And this will also mobilize the iron from the storage tissues into the RBC pool, and that will cause the iron deficiency in the neonate that will have long-term poor neurodevelopmental outcomes in these neonates. So it is very important to understand the Pedersen hypothesis when we encounter any infant of diabetic mother and what all complications we can expect. So various anomalies are most commonly are CNS and cardiac anomalies. Anencephaly and spina bifida are 13 to 20 times more common in infant of diabetic mother. So most specific anomalies are caudal regression syndrome, which is due to incomplete development of lumbar and sacral vertebrae. And this is associated with neurological impairment due to involvement of the distal spine. This can result in fecal and urinary incontinence, decreased growth and movement of the legs. So caudal regression syndrome is very specific anomaly for infant of diabetic mother. So this is an anencephaly baby on the left side and a caudal regression syndrome on the right side. So cardiovascular anomalies occur in 30 to 50% of infant of diabetic mother. There is increased risk of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. There will be thickened intraventricular septum. This can reduce the outflow left ventricular outflow tract, and 5 to 10% may have respiratory distress, poor cardiac output, and also they may even present with heart failure. So how can we diagnose this hypertrophic cardiomyopathy? It can be obvious on chest X-ray, or best it is diagnosed by echocardiography, which can show intraventricular septal thickening. And this cardiomyopathy in an infant of diabetic mother is transient and it resolves within 2 to 3 weeks. As the fetal insulin levels, which were higher in the fetal time, they decrease and it normalizes subsequently. And echocardiographic resolution of cardiomyopathy will take around 6 to 12 months time. And poor diabetic control in first trimester will increase the risk of congenital malformations. And 2/3 of the congenital anomalies which are seen in IDM are cardiovascular or CNS related. And most common cardiac anomalies are transposition of great arteries, ASD, VSD, and coarctation of aorta. And so VSD and TGA are increased 5-fold in a uncontrolled diabetic mother during the first trimester. So there is decrease, the congenital anomalies are less likely in a GDM mother where she develops in abnormal glucose tolerance during second and third trimester where already organogenesis already occurred. So these are the representative echocardiographic and pathological specimen of cardiology, cardiac structure showing hypertrophic ventricular wall and also intraventricular septum, which will decrease the size of the left ventricle. Left ventricle size is very small and it will decrease, it will result in diastolic dysfunction and also even an outflow tract obstruction in such a neonate. So gastrointestinal anomalies are small left colon syndrome, transient inability to pass meconium or duodenal atresia, imperforate anus, and even situs inversus can occur. So this in this representative diagram, there is situs inversus wherein the liver is pushed to the right side of the body and the heart is liver is to the left side of the body and heart is turned towards the right side of the body. The other genitourinary anomalies like renal agenesis, hydronephrosis, and ureteral duplication can occur. This is one of the barium enema study of small left colon syndrome, wherein after splenic flexure of colon, the caliber of the colon is very much decreased, and this infant may show features of delayed passage of meconium or even a feature of intestinal obstruction also. So baby may have growth abnormalities either in the form of macrosomia or even IUGR also. Macrosomia, it is 4 times more common in infant of diabetic mother. IUGR is more common in GDM mothers who have vasculopathy, who have diabetic nephropathy or diabetic retinopathy, which are the surrogates of vasculopathy. So those mothers will have increased risk of preeclampsia resulting in placental insufficiency. And IUGR is also seen in those mothers where we aggressively target the glucose control and we excessively give treatment, and aggressive glucose control also can result in poor growth of the neonate. So what is the pathophysiology of macrosomia? So there will be delivery of abnormal nutrient mixture to the fetoplacental unit, and plus there will be an abnormal confluence of growth factors which is coming from the fetus, that is insulin like growth factors which are coming within the fetus, plus there will be abnormal nutrient delivery. So there will be excess adipose deposition, especially visceral organ hypertrophy occurs, especially if there is deposition of fat which is present in around the visceral organs, around the in the abdomen is very markedly characteristic of infant of diabetic mother. So there will be liver and heart enlargement. Skeletal growth is increased proportional to weight. However, the brain size is not increased relative to the gestational age. So a continuous association between maternal glucose values and cord C peptide levels and birth weight of more than 90th percentile has been studied in the famous HAPO study. And also the HAPO study also shows a link between maternal hyperglycemia and cord C peptide and the levels of neonatal adiposity. If we see the fat study in the neonates, there will be close link between maternal sugar levels and cord C peptide levels. And first and second trimester ultrasounds can usually the differences are usually undetectable with USG, whereas after 24 weeks, if we see the growth velocity of ITM fetus, the abdominal circumference typically begins to rise. So this is one of the clue that the baby is going into a macrosomia. However, the head growth of the fetus will fall behind and it will match the normal fetuses. Only the abdominal circumference will overtake the head growth. And abdominal circumference significantly exceeds that of control after 32 weeks of gestation. It is noted to be around 1.36 centimeter per week in IDM fetuses compared to only 0.9 centimeter per week in normal non-diabetic fetuses in non-diabetic mothers. And so even when the fetus or the neonate is appropriate for gestational age, these infants have been noted to have increased fat mass, especially in the shoulder region and in the central compartment, that is abdomen region. So there is high chance, even though the baby is AGA, there is higher chance that these mothers can have shoulder dystocia and they may be prone for asphyxia. So what are the perinatal complications? There may be perinatal mortality, which may be because of congenital anomalies or because of RDS or because of prematurity. There may be number of birth injuries that can occur. Neonatal morbidity and mortality can be because of polycythemia and hyperviscosity, neonatal hypoglycemia, hyperbilirubinemia, and respiratory distress syndrome, and hypertrophic and congestive cardiomyopathy can occur. So our neonate had all the neonatal morbidities that have been highlighted in the red, like polycythemia, neonatal hypoglycemia, hyperbilirubinemia, and respiratory distress syndrome. Prematurity is more common in this diabetic infant, in these diabetic mothers compared to non-diabetic pregnancies. In terms of 31% versus 20%. This may be because of either related to higher rates of UTIs in this mother, or they may have maternal preeclampsia, or it may be there may be an iatrogenic premature delivery also because of inappropriate assessment of gestational age or by the scans, or because of overgrowth in the baby. There may be perinatal asphyxia, which may be due to hyperglycemia that may occur during the labor or because of prematurity, or there may be vasculopathy, which can be represented by diabetic nephropathy in the mother. Because of vasculopathy, there may be fetal hypoxia. Already there will be compromised intrauterine environment, and this baby may present with perinatal asphyxia. So shoulder dystocia is the most important risk that may result in birth trauma. It is seen in almost 1/3 of IDMs, which are more than 4,000 grams, and there is 1.7 times greater risk of shoulder dystocia. Because the cause may be because of distribution of fat in the shoulders and in the upper back, that is interscapular region. This may also result in brachial plexus injury, clavicular and humeral fractures, cephalhematoma, subdural hemorrhage, facial palsy, and also increased cesarean sections. So there may be increased risk of brachial plexus injury, perinatal asphyxia, and also cephalhematoma that can be seen as part of birth injuries. Respiratory distress syndrome, as already discussed, it may be because of hyperinsulinemia that will prevent lung maturation, which are, and also there can be transient tachypnea of newborn, which may be seen in cesarean section deliveries due to macrosomia. So other metabolic complications like hypocalcemia can occur during first 24 to 72 hours. Cause attributed to low parathyroid hormone related peptide and parathyroid hormone in infant. And it may be asymptomatic, which can resolve on its own, or there may be an excessive jitness, tachypnea, or they may even throw seizures or tetany also. Sometimes there may be apneic episodes also. So hypomagnesemia is also seen in around 40% of IDMs. And due to renal losses in the diabetic mother, the baby may have low magnesium levels. It is usually transient and asymptomatic. Hypomagnesemia is treated only if there is symptomatic hypocalcemia, which is not getting corrected only by treating calcium. So hypoglycemia is the most dangerous complication, which can be encountered in 27% of infant of diabetic mother. Usually occurs in first few hours of life, most commonly seen in macrosomic infants. This is because there will be persistent hyperinsulinemia. After the cord is clamped, suddenly the supply of glucose from the mother to the baby is cut off, whereas the insulin levels persistently remain high in the neonate. So the baby may not able to take feed, or even in spite of giving adequate feeds, the baby may have low sugar records. It may be asymptomatic also, or it may be symptomatic also, which requires aggressive management. So these are the representative MRI that can showing damage to parietal and occipital region in neonates, wherein who have even asymptomatic prolonged hypoglycemia, or those with symptomatic hypoglycemia. These infants are going to have significant damage to parietal and occipital lobes of brain, which may have long-term sequelae in the form of cerebral palsy or poor cognitive and vision development in these neonates. So polycythemia occurs in 13 to 33%. So it may result in hyperviscosity syndrome. So hematocrit, routine checking of hematocrit is not required in all infant of diabetic mother. However, if they are symptomatic or overtly polycythemic, we can consider checking hematocrit around 12 hours of life. Intervention is required only when hematocrit is more than 65 with symptoms or 75 when asymptomatic. And hyperbilirubinemia seen around 11 to 29%. Risk factors include prematurity or birth injury resulting in bruising or cephalhematoma, or polycythemia itself causing increased hemolysis and increased release of bilirubin. And I would like to add for polycythemia is current evidence does not support any exchange, any partial exchange transfusion due to no evidence for long-term neurodevelopmental outcome. So other long-term metabolic risks are type 2 diabetes mellitus are more common in infant of diabetic mother to an extent of 45% in compared to general population, that is 1.4%. And type 1 diabetes mellitus are more common in children of diabetic fathers compared to diabetic mothers. So if the children are born to a diabetic father, then there is 6.1% risk of having a type 1 diabetes mellitus. And the macrosomia of the baby usually resolves by age, first year of life. However, the obesity can recur again during the adolescent age group and even in the early adult age. And the BMI is higher in infant of diabetic mothers compared to others, with mean of 24.6 versus 20.9 during adolescent and adulthood. So management of an infant during a gestational diabetes mellitus is mother having a gestational diabetes mellitus or a pre-existing diabetes are considered to be high risk factor according to NRP, and there should be an adequate preparation for the delivery with 2 experienced neonatologists attending the delivery and a standby team which is present at call, and we should follow all basic standard steps of resuscitation for the infant. And we should avoid fetal hypoxemia, and we should promote smooth postnatal transition. And it is advised to use combined insulin and glucose infusion during labor to maintain maternal glucose in a narrow range of 80 to 110. If you are, and the capillary blood glucose level are monitored hourly during delivery. We should avoid long-acting insulin given on the day of delivery, and we should switch over to regular insulin as described by ma'am, and should be used to meet the insulin needs of the mother during the labor. So post-delivery, we have to observe the baby for asphyxia, birth injury, malformation, any macrosomia is there, hypoglycemia is there, and respiratory distress occurs should be managed as in our index case. So these are the gross appearance of infant of diabetic mother, which can give clue that the baby, even though it is not, it may not be diagnosed in the mother of gestational diabetes mellitus, some clue in the baby like birth weight, which lies more than 90th percentile or more than 4,000 gram baby, a plethorically looking baby or a puffy baby with increased fat pads over the upper cheek, back, and also on the lower jaw, and also a presence of hairy pinna or hair on the forehead with a normal size head and a large shoulder and increased fat deposition on the back of the baby are subtle clues that can give during the delivery that you may be encountering an infant of diabetic mother. So management, if it is an SGA or LGA baby, we should monitor for the complications as we already described. Only if there is symptomatic, we have to treat the hypoglycemia or hypomagnesemia or hypocalcemia. And respiratory distress have to be monitored and managed according to cardiopulmonary support or a CPAP. And echo should be done to search the cause for any respiratory distress, if it is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy causing the respiratory distress. And hyperbilirubinemia definitely warrants phototherapy. And polycythemia only if it is significant and severely symptomatic, we have to manage. If there are neuro and GI and genitourinary anomalies, we have to consult the experts, and also we have to do imaging studies for further management. And the lab testing for hypoglycemia and polycythemia, first glucose monitoring should be done within 1 to 2 hours after birth. And if there are symptoms as and when required, we have to monitor the glucose. And glucose monitoring should be pre-feed and should be continued for first 12 to 24 hours of life. And routinely checking hematocrit is not required. Only if they are overtly plethoric and symptomatic, hematocrit should be checked at 12 hours of life. And if cyanosis is present, we have to assess for cardiac and respiratory etiology. And if symptomatic, only consider calcium and to be addressed. This is the American Academy of Pediatrics protocol for management of symptomatic and asymptomatic hypoglycemia, which has been already known to all in the protocol. So prognosis, the morbidity and mortality lessen with adequate diabetes control during pregnancy. And if diabetes is poorly controlled, there is higher risk of neurodevelopmental deficit. There is also higher risk of cerebral palsy and epilepsy in the infant of diabetic mother if there are hypoglycemic encephalopathy and damage to the brain. The risk of childhood obesity, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome are also increased in infant of diabetic mother. So with this, the take-home message should be universal screening for all pregnant women between 24 to 28 weeks for diabetes with OGTT. And if they are diagnosed with GDM, tight glycemic control will prevent the fetal and neonatal morbidities due to maternal hyperglycemia. And intrapartum hyperglycemia can also result in neonatal comorbidities, which we have seen. and educating pregnant women and family members about the blood sugar monitoring and the adverse effects that that happens due to inappropriate monitoring or hyperglycemia should be taught to the family members, and monitoring for neonatal complications and timely management will prevent long-term neurodevelopmental sequelae in a neonate. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Anil, for that extensive presentation on infant of diabetic mother. So before inviting comments from the other participants, I would like to invite Dr. Vandana Madam for any comments on the obstetric part.
Sir, it was really excellent. Dr. Akshaya, congratulations.